Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, Joe shares his non-traditional path from a non-target school, the University of Wisconsin, to breaking into investment banking at Merril Lynch right before it was acquired by Bank of America. Perhaps more impressive than that feat was his ability to land a highly competitive buy-side associate role straight into Bain Capital Ventures and then break into Harvard Business School a few years after that. His latest move was to pivot after several years at Samsung's venture arm to found his own venture capital firm. Not surprisingly, that is also going well for him. Learn what he thinks set him apart and why he spent an extra year in college. Enjoy. All right, Joe, thanks so much for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Should be great if you could just start out with a short bio for the listeners.
Sure. So I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and attended University of Wisconsin, where I studied business, dual major in finance and real estate. I was kind of a Badger since I could walk, with all of my parents and grandparents having attended the university. So I was super proud to call that my home for 5 years, which we can get into later. But so went from there and was fortunate to land an internship at Merril Lynch M&A in New York City, where I ended up summering and then spending 2 years in the banking world, and jumped from that to Bain Capital Ventures in Boston. At the time, kind of the Boston office was the main office. There was less of a presence in New York and SF, so got to have some exposure to venture capital and growth equity while I was there. And then attended Harvard Business School for 2 years, also in Boston and Cambridge. And following that, helped to build out Samsung's venture capital team in New York City, which was a high-tech software practice. Was there for about 3 years before doing what I'm doing now, which is running a venture capital fund called Studio VC along with one other partner.
Great. So there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start all the way back in undergrad. So you were a Badger, and going through that school, was it a school you kind of had targeted since you were, in high school? Was it like you said, kind of your whole family went there, I guess, right?
Yeah. I mean, I practically grew up on campus. So my first informal job was I started parking cars for football games on football Saturdays at my parents' house. And then being a young and budding entrepreneur, started to buy out all of my neighbors' lots and eventually turned it into a nice little business, which was helpful because my whole plan was, and kind of out of necessity, was to put myself through undergrad. And so, the cost was right to stay in state and also, really valued the fact that I could get right into the business program pretty early on.
Are your parents entrepreneurial like that, or was that just something?
My mom was a teacher, special needs teacher, and my dad has been in sales and entrepreneurship for almost his whole career. But yeah, between the two of them, they launched, I tried to count it up the other day, but it was something like 7 kind of part-time or full-time businesses. And so, yeah, dinner table conversations were everything from a new pet treat that my parents worked on together to a crazy bumper sticker idea that my dad came up with and sold. And the latest thing, which my dad is pursuing, is a cheese curd business, which is
cheese curd.
Cheese curd. Yeah, so it's kind of Wisconsin's favorite food, and he's now evangelizing it around Florida and the rest of the East Coast.
That's awesome. So it was kind of in the blood. You're kind of doing well for yourself, putting yourself through school, mostly through this parking business, or how did you?
Yeah, I mean, it was that and a variety of other odd jobs. I guess my first formal job was I was a caddy at a golf course. So that was a big part of my early life, was playing competitive golf and competitive hockey. Cool. And, while I was not quite good enough to play at Wisconsin, I did use those to get into the industry and work in the golf industry for a little while to help pay my way as well. But I mean, I was super passionate fan of the Badgers, and then, heard nothing of good things, but good things about the business program as undergrads there. So yeah, I was really excited to go. I had a couple of reach schools that I thought would be neat to try out, but at the end of the day, the kind of cost benefit and staying in state was right for me. And was fortunate to have a ton of friends that kind of went from my high school to college and was able to maintain those relationships, which was kind of like a built-in little frat without being a frat.
That's awesome. And so did you, you said you had known about the business program before you went, but was banking kind of what everyone put on a pedestal, or was it even known? When did you kind of know to even target investment banking or what it was?
Awesome question. I can speak for myself, and I really did not know what an investment banker did when I started at Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
And as I started to dive more into the curriculum and learn about some of the folks that had sort of found success coming out of Wisconsin, it became more apparent that investment banking was an amazing first career and a fantastic way to learn business schools, drinking from the firehouses, I'm sure people say all the time on here. But, I didn't really realize that until I was a couple years into my undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had the opportunity to do an internship at SC Johnson, the large consumer products company that makes things like Glade plugins and things like that, and cleaning products. But while I was there, I was working in corporate development, and kind of went into that thinking, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to get to see all these big corporate deals and maybe even get to work on an acquisition or a divestiture on behalf of this big company. And even though I had a fantastic time and the team there was like just terrific to work for, and like especially at that young age, really did the hand holding necessary to sort of like bring me into the workforce. What I did learn was that like deals were not happening left and right within the context of corporate development. And so I started to think, well, if I want to get like my hands on actual meaningful deals, what's the career for that? And then I came back from that internship and said, I really want to do investment banking. And unfortunately, I was pretty late to realize that. So this is me coming back from my junior year
So going into
at
senior
SC
year.
Johnson, and
This
coming
is
into my senior year and sort of hoping to do investment banking seemed unlikely. So I decided to actually add a major and treat my post senior year as another internship opportunity, which is how I landed Merril Lynch M&A.
I've heard of that. Is that a thing now where people, when they find out about investment banking too late and they miss that kind of sophomore, junior, summer internship? Have you heard of a lot of kids doing that now, staying an extra whole year? Because
I
it's a
hadn't at
financial.
I
It's a
hadn't at the time. It's for whatever reason it's relatively common at Wisconsin.
Mm,
People have a number of majors. It's a very large school, and sometimes graduating on time is difficult on its own. But let alone wanting to add an internship. So it kind of worked out in my favor and allowed me to sort of mature intellectually and professionally a little bit more, and also just learn the tools and interview skills, and spend a lot of time probably reading your website trying to get ready for an investment banking internship. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I had a few investment banking internship interviews the first summer around, and I think if I had a video of those, I'd want to light those tapes on fire. But coming back the next year
yeah.
was just so much more well prepared, and that was partially thanks to a lot of my peers at Wisconsin that sort of
Mm-hmm.
showed me and others the ropes in terms of what it takes to get in an investment banking internship and full-time job.
Yeah, I
And
think.
then in the future we try to pay that forward after coming back from our internships, and seeing what the real work looks like, and be able to tell the folks a year younger than us kind of what's necessary to get on Wall Street.
Yeah, it's interesting that, did you feel like, were you doing a lot of mock interviews with those people, or was it more just like being able to talk to, oh, I've spoken with XYZ person? What was the most helpful part about that?
Mock interviews were super helpful, but I think we were pretty deliberate about really learning the skills and sort of topics that were necessary to understand and have command over before doing the mock interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just diving into the mock interviews without knowing some of the questions and preparing for them, and like having a unique but accurate answer for them,
Mm-hmm.
um, was the best part about it. So started with prep. We had seniors teaching juniors and juniors teaching sophomores. Everything from like 3 ways to model a company or value a company,
Mm-hmm.
to accounting questions, to the quirky trick questions that come up in banking
Was it a
interviews.
club? Was it like a club?
It was, yeah. It was called the Investment Banking Club,
Mm-hmm.
and it was founded, maybe 1 or 2 years before I got involved with it,
Mm-hmm.
but ended up taking a leadership role there. And we've expanded it, but at the same time tried to keep it relatively manageable, just so that we didn't have 150 kids trying to learn investment banking skills. It's always been sort of between I think 20 and 40 students that were interested in the space, and as a result, we were able to be somewhat selective about who participated, but also cultivate a good learning environment that wasn't the size of a large lecture.
How is that done nowadays? Where is the club? Obviously, like GPA can be part of it, but like what else is? Do they have to be finance majors, economics majors? What's the cutoff? Or like they have to interview to get into the club?
Yeah, we did used to have interviews and obviously like a resume type screen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were looking at sort of like what are the likely traits that would help somebody land a job on Wall Street, because we were trying to, like, our number one KPI was, are we going to place people on Wall Street or in comparable banking situations? And so,
Right.
we would review resumes as if we were recruiters from investment banks. And so, that was the first vetting mechanism. And then the second was like, willingness to be collaborative and help teach others eventually and things like that. But yeah, it was pretty multifaceted. And I mean, we were students teaching other students. So it was, it's, I'm sure, become even more formal over the years, but we did everything we could, and it was fairly selective. So I was really happy to be a part of that.
Cool. So you figured out what you want to do. You start actually preparing through this club, and then you start dropping your resumes again, kind of as a second junior, kind of
Yeah,
or a
exactly.
second. And
Yeah. So it
how
just
did
kind of went with
you,
the flow. Yeah.
did banks ask you any questions about that? Was it on the resume drops? Were there any, like, in your first rounds, were there any like, hey, what's this fifth year all about, or expected date?
Yeah. Good question. Remembering back, I didn't get a lot of pushback on that. I think it was more like, hey, it's great that last summer you had somewhat relevant experience looking at whether or not you did deals or not. At least you looked at deals and and tried to evaluate deals from a large corporate perspective, which is pretty relevant to banking without being banking.
Right.
So net, that was definitely a positive. And just to double tap on what you said about the resume drops, coming from Wisconsin, we kind of we didn't benefit from a lot of banks coming directly to us at that time. Now they're starting to become much more open to it,
Mm-hmm.
since we have a little track record. But at the time, it was really like, who do you know? Which Badgers do you know? Which people in the Big Ten do you know? And then, we all kind of paid our own way to come out to New York, and really camped out for like 4 days at a really cruddy hotel in Midtown and set up. I think we probably met with 10 or 12 investment banks, basically whoever would have us, and
Mm-hmm.
covered a lot of ground. And some of those banks were kind of nice enough to even do some screening while we were out here. And others said, drop your resume, we'll see what happens after this. But during that trip, some of the folks, myself included, got interviewed by a bunch of banks, and then were able to come back for super days and things like that later on.
How did it's really interesting. So guys and girls went as a group. How many of, like, that trip, that New York trip that you guys did, how many people went on that when you
I
got,
think it was
your
probably almost every single junior or kind of junior level person in the club. So that was probably like 15 or so.
it's a pretty good group.
Yeah, I
And
want to say that like the seniors versus the juniors versus the sophomores, and sophomores were pretty rare, but we would have about like 15 seniors, 15 juniors, so 30 to 40 people in the club at any given time. But
was there a
yeah,
certain, like, success rate where, like, the seniors were too late by that point, where
well,
they
so a lot of them were just kind of still involved to like do more of the teaching and continue to prep on their own side and do case studies and things like that to get ready for their full-time roles.
but wouldn't they already
Um,
have full-time offers by the time they were in
yeah,
this
so
club?
yeah, some of the seniors who like helped facilitate a lot of this.
They already were set up.
The trip was comprised of like 95% juniors, if not
Yeah.
maybe even 100% juniors, but it was certainly facilitated by the folks who had positive experiences at places like Merril or Goldman or JP or wherever. But yeah, like I said, we ended up having enough connectivity to get in and at least sit in a conference room and learn about folks like I just mentioned, and a bunch of others. But yeah, it was literally like 10 banks in 3 days, and some of those yielded kind of immediate callbacks of like, hey, we reviewed the 14 or 15 resumes of the people who came, and we'd like to have a quick conversation with the following 6. And some of those ended up leading to
So
follow up
was it
fly out to New York.
Was it competitive, almost inter group? Because it's kind of like if they're only going to interview a certain percentage of you, it's got to feel a little like intimidating. I guess you're kind of rooting for each other because you're all together doing it. But
Yeah, we're very team oriented, and I think fortunately, in most of those cases where they did interview, on the spot, so to speak, it was very much like almost everyone got that 30 minute or 45-minute first screening interview. So there wasn't too much competition there. But then, as things progressed and, you know, 2 out of 10 made it to the super day and the other 8 didn't.
yeah,
Fortunately, I think, people made it to some bank at the end of the day,
yeah.
whether it was like a Midwestern bank or a Wall Street bank. I think everybody landed. The hit rate was very, very high.
The placement was great even earlier on in those days because it was such a small group and a focus group.
Yeah, I was just super scrappy, and we had a couple, at least 1 year of interns preceding us that had done good work and kind of paved the way. And so, yeah, those kind of first guys and girls who busted through the door really helped the follow up years.
That's awesome. And so, do you feel like, I know there's tons of investment banking clubs all around the country. Do you feel like they're becoming more prevalent? I know I've heard this many times that they're like really important to get into, or some are really competitive. Do you feel like if somebody has an offer to stay in state and they have like a competing offer, it's a good path still potentially if they really focus on getting into that club? And like, what happens if you don't get into that club? Like, what happens if you don't get into that club for whatever reason? That's why I was asking a little bit about, because I'm sure it's at Wisconsin, but it's also at like UMich, Penn State, like all these schools that send a lot of people to Wall Street, but overall it's a very small fraction of the student population.
Yeah, I think back when we were doing it, like 2005, 6, 7, kind of when I graduated undergrad, really our best comp at the time was Indiana University. I think had the best and earliest
Kelly,
investment banking, and just kind of the Kelly School of Business, which is widely known as pretty well represented on Wall Street. So that was one of the ways we modeled ourselves. And what you just mentioned, like I wasn't even aware of all those different clubs at the different schools, but certainly fantastic to hear. And I mean, whether or not you get into the club or not, I think you can benefit from a lot of the same things that we did, which seem really low level. But things as simple as like basically memorizing like the Vault interview guide to finance and the Vault interview guide to investment banking. Like that's where all of our mock interview and material and questions that we prepared for came from in the first place. And then, once you get some boots on the ground on Wall Street, you sort of get that echo effect of people saying, well, we thought they were going to ask lots about accounting, but they actually didn't. They focused more on like finance and valuation or, real world learnings like that, as opposed to like purely theoretical learnings that you might get out of a book or a guide.
No, for sure. Yeah. I mean, for us, we have an interview course actually for investment banking now. And so the Vault is like old school, man. You're dating yourself.
I mean, I'm sure it was like
I'm just kidding.
PDF that we all printed out.
Yeah,
too.
There's much better options out there. No, just kidding. So the interesting part is, so you guys all, it's interesting that you all kind of made it somewhere into investment banking, or at least somewhat comparable careers. You yourself and one other seem to have made it to kind of the best firms or a bulge bracket firm. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, my year there was folks that made it to a variety of the bulge bracket firms. So some of those folks have even stayed on. So yeah, I mean, Goldman, Morgan, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, all the sort of who's who. I think we had representation at. That's awesome. Whether it was my year or the year behind me. So. And then it was good. I mean, and now I think you have some folks who've stayed on, some senior folks like at GS, where I still have a close friend who's now becoming pretty senior, and the representation of Badgers has increased over time as well, which is great to see.
And I guess going back to those trips and those screens, was there anything you felt that was different about how they interviewed your group, or different about what set you apart from the people within your group that would be helpful to someone listening? Like, is there something that you could point to say, okay, that makes sense. This is why I got through and this person got through and this person didn't? Was it more just how well spoken you were, how well prepared you were? Do you feel like was the most important factors? in
I
getting?
think failing at the interviews when I mentioned I wanted to like burn those videotapes from the year before
Yeah.
was really helpful. It was like I basically got to get a major league at bat
Hmm.
that didn't really accrue to my stat sheet, so to speak. Like I got to go interview with, I think Robert W. Baird, investment banking, and like Piper Jaffray, and I probably was very woefully underprepared in my junior year, as I said. And
Hmm.
so when I came back to interview the next time around, I was like, I know exactly how hard it's going to be. I know how intense it's going to be. I know how intimidating some of these folks can be. And so like there were fewer surprises. So I think that definitely helps on the poise side, just to be able to like know what you're getting into. And
Yeah.
then obviously having a full year to brush up on the content and hone my own story, which is, kind of like I started describing earlier, which is kind of like entrepreneurial from a very young age and like interested in business from a young age. Always love math, love business, put the two together, you get an investment banker.
Fair. So your story was more convincing, more genuine. By that point, you had kind of worked on it for a good year.
Yeah, and
You,
we were all kind of interesting and different, for good or for bad, in the sense that we weren't coming to them through the typical channel. Like
right.
the interviews I'm describing were like one-off random days that they put together just for us.
Yeah.
And then if we made it through, then we would go to like something like a super day, which was the typical process. But we were coming from this like kind of left field angle where I think we probably got some credit just for being scrappy. Like, how'd you guys get in here again? Who do you know? And why am I interviewing you? That's like, you didn't go to my alma mater.
Right.
So for good or for bad, we were interesting because of that.
Okay. Fair enough. So you're starting, you didn't have, or you did have a normal internship then the summer before. So were you nervous that like you weren't going to be ready or weren't going to get the return offer? Were the return offers high that summer?
Return offers were, yeah, they were pretty high. So I think that was 2006 going into 2007.
Right. So
So
things hadn't collapsed yet.
everything still looked pretty rosy. And then, yeah, the 2 years, or just short of 2 years that I spent at Merril M&A, led right up to 2009 and the eventual acquisition and takeover, Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. So got to see that kind of on the inside track, and fortunately had already, pretty early on in the process lined up the Bain Capital Ventures offer. And so I was happy to be an innocent bystander, but it was interesting to see the drama unfold from inside the bank, where some more senior folks were, had a lot more at stake than I did as somebody who was prepared to make my exit anyhow. But
Hmm.
yeah, wild times, but certainly a great learning experience, and learned a lot about myself, and learned a lot about kind of finance and deal making, even though I also learned that it probably wasn't a career that I was going to pursue for the rest of my life.
Was it something about the banking? So you were, what group were you in again? You were
I
in
was in
M&A?
mergers and acquisitions. So
So
that was,
you were in M&A. Did you get a lot of deals done in the 2 years you were there? I assume it was like busy and it dried up completely or what?
yeah, I mean, I wish I had more completed deals to talk about. I did work, a bit on Anheuser-Busch InBev, which was obviously a huge 60 billion plus deal.
Hmm.
And then a variety of other deals that, just never made it across the finish line. But,
Right.
um, yeah, no, you're exactly right. As things started to slow down, as banks and bankers started to get, fighting and smelling the blood in the water, as there was a lot of change coming about in the market, broadly speaking. So
Yeah. And so then tell me about the process. Was there ever a thought of when you said you went Bain Venture, which is kind of
yeah,
you going banking straight to venture is very uncommon, at least from what I've
yeah.
seen. Tell me a little bit about, did you consider private equity? Why not go private equity? Did you interview there? What was the whole process like in terms of why venture?
Yeah, so I guess, about 5 or 6 months into my full-time role
Mhm.
is when, at that time, when the headhunters started sort of like banging down the door and setting up preliminary meetings. So it was literally like the holiday season of my first year, that I started sort of engaging with the headhunter community. And, mostly it was oriented towards like, do you want to do hedge fund or private equity? And I kind of pretty quickly thought I wanted to do private equity because, as much as I enjoy public market investing, I thought my personality and skill set would lend itself better to just sort of doing deals where you have more ownership and control.
Yep.
And so definitely thought I was going to do private equity, and immediately started interviewing, with the help of all these headhunters. of which there was probably 8 that I was working with at the time. But took the interviews with Carlisle and Apollo and Cerberus and just like kind of everybody you could think of. But
Mm-hmm.
went through some process, multi-step process with folks like Carlisle and others, and really thought for sure that's where I was going to go.
Yeah.
And was had the quick rejects elsewhere, and then had some long processes with other PE firms. But during that process, it was reached out to about Bain Capital Ventures, and they said, hey, look, they do venture and sort of some growth type checks and interesting tech enabled businesses and technology companies. Would you be interested in meeting with them? And I said, sure. So the one thing I can say about that interview was that I had 2-hour-long interviews with the Bain Capital Ventures partners right to start.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just kind of left that meeting. And I remember calling up my mom at the time and just being like, that was the best interview I've ever had.
In terms of your performance, or in terms of just the feeling?
No, not my performance. Like, was still probably unsure of at that point of how the performance went, but it was more so like I could tell that the people who were interviewing me were going to be a strong cultural fit for me. And incidentally, one of them was Midwestern, so it kind of made me feel like I was talking to my one of my dad's friends. So just like culturally was a good fit. But then the second part of it was really just that like it felt tremendously intellectually engaging. So it was more about like let's process a market, let's process a new business idea, let's think about it both financially and strategically. Let's put it all together and evaluate an opportunity together. So I kind of left like, wow, that was a really cool, much more like a case study, rather than the super day at Carlisle where I remember being put in a room and like building a model in an hour, right? Which to me felt a little bit more rote. I mean, it was certainly high pressure, and it's a huge part of the job. But I didn't like leave that exercise feeling tremendously fulfilled. Other than I was like, well, I got to an answer. I'm happy. Like I was able to crank this out as fast as I needed to. But the Bain Capital Ventures, I just kind of like left, and I was like, boy, I want to continue thinking about the opportunity we just discussed. That was really interesting.
So did you get offers from the mega funds, or tell me about like the timeline? So you had started some processes with the mega fund. I know it can be crazy fast when it starts, and then like it's all done within a weekend. So did Bain Cap kind of come in the second wave, or what was the?
Yeah, I don't know. They were pretty early, because I remember some of these other processes that I mentioned were still underway at the time. And I'm sure I'd gotten like a few quick dings, but some other processes were going on longer. But once I started engaging with Bain Capital Ventures, they moved pretty quickly as well. And so following that, the first 2 partner meetings, I think the next step was flying to Boston and meeting really with all the rest of the partners, which I think at the time was like 8 or 9 more partners, which was the entire partnership at the time. So their super day was like you meet everybody and you get a pretty quick judgment. So it was, and those interviews were more of the same in terms of like being less tactical and more diving into businesses and like ripping them apart from a viability standpoint.
A little more consulting kind of.
I think Bain Capital Ventures and Bain Capital Private Equity definitely have some of that consulting DNA. Both because they hire from those areas pretty extensively, but also because they were just kind of birthed out of them. And so, you see kind of the way they approach diligence, on the job is pretty reflective of how deep and wide, I think a consultant would go if they were mapping like an entire market, for example.
Right.
And that filtered down to the ventures group, which is like, okay, fine, you're looking at a $5 million Series A, but let's approach this from a pretty definitely not shoot from the hip, much more like deep analysis and large decks that cover a lot of ground. So for me, that was a great foundational place to kind of learn diligence and learn about growth investing.
So you get the offer after that partner meeting, I'm sure right after they call you up and give you the offer. And
I know exactly where I was standing.
Tell me.
I was standing, it was probably like...
Were you still in Boston?
Pretty late. No, I was back in New York. I was, so Merril Lynch's office was right down near where Goldman is now, down on VC Street, at the Seaport in New York. And I or not the seaport, but World Financial Center.
Okay.
And so I was standing on the water. I popped out because I knew they were going to call. And yeah, I was pretty late at night because I was still at my banking desk, but I popped out to take the call. And yeah, I was just like thrilled to get the offer and was pretty sure I was going to take it shortly thereafter.
And so that was what, a year and a half before you were supposed to start? So
Yeah,
it
I
was
want to
still,
say,
I would call it still on cycle. Let's call it still
yeah,
on cycle, but just
yeah,
different.
yeah. So that was in spring of 2008. Sorry. Yeah.
Isn't it? And so was there any sort of pullback from the PE funds, do you think, from after since we were in the depths of the financial crisis or like the whole economy collapsing right around then? Was there any?
I think like fortunately, being that it was still 2000, it was 2007 turning into 2008. I
Oh,
think
it
the
was.
recruiting cycle was still
Yeah.
really strong, which is good. And as far as I know, like my other peers in the M&A group, I think there was 12 of us, I want to say, and I think 11 of us left after 1 or 2 years. But
Mhm.
yeah, nobody like got a PE offer and then it was rescinded or anything
Okay.
crazy like that, as far as I can remember, at least not from my group.
Okay. And so you had this offer, things really started kind of changing the following year in your second year.
Yeah.
And was there any sort of like, hey, I want to get out of here? Was it hard to work when you had that offer in hand? I can imagine I didn't have an offer until like 3 months before I left my banking gig.
Oh
I can't
yeah. I mean, I think
imagine.
it definitely, both because, you're already looking towards your next gig, but also because I didn't really go into the process, as we discussed earlier. I didn't go into it thinking, oh, I'm going to go do VC and growth. I was like, boy, this is like a kind of a reorientation from these mega deals that I'm like toiling away at 2 a.m. on, to deals that frankly I was more interested in, smaller, growthier deals that were more tech driven. And so like I also had this kind of like existential thing happening, aside from just
Like,
showing up to
can I
work.
leave early and go on vacation and just take 6 months off before
Yeah.
this?
No, they still wrung us out pretty good. But
Yeah.
I think
Did you get
the
time
hard part
off
about that
before?
was,
Did you get time
what's
off
that?
before? Did you get time off before the jump?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was there right up until the Bank of America merger, and so there came a time in the spring of 2009 when the actual offices were combining.
Mm-hmm.
And so for people who were on like live deals, they said, okay, well, we're going to make you move from World Financial Center up to Bryant Park and kind of join up with your B of A colleagues, and you'll be there for like 4 months until you leave. And for folks who were not on live deals and who had offers, they were like, you don't have to make the move. So I actually had an extended period of time, which was
Amazing.
really nice to sort of like go reconnect with all the people that I'd lost touch with while banking.
Did you travel at all, or you just like hung out and
I went back to Wisconsin and spent a good deal of the summer there, which is the time to be there. And yeah, mostly just spent time with my family, and had some family illness that was going on, and so was trying to spend more quality time back there. Unfortunately, it just kind of all worked out that way.
Nice. So you had a little bit of a breather. You kind of moved to Boston, what, a couple weeks before you start, or a month before you start, and
Yeah.
what was that like? So complete different culture, 180. What it was going from banking to venture. Tell me about that.
So my associate class at Bain Capital Ventures was myself and 3 other hires. All 3 of the other hires were ex-consultants.
Oh, interesting.
So that was one interesting wrinkle. And then we also did kind of like a global training program for several weeks where we were all together with the private equity team as well.
Hmm.
And kind of intermingled for a period of time, which was interesting. But
What
yeah,
was
kind of hit the
what was the
ground.
training like? Is just like general like consulting? Like this is how you
Oh
work in the
man, I'd have
industry?
to look back. I think I still have some of the materials somewhere. But yeah, it was. I think for some of the consultants, there was probably some like valuation kind of
Finance stuff.
finance
Yeah.
boot camp, and for us, for me as a banker in the venture group, was kind of the opposite. So that was one kind of cool thing, was that I think I learned from my consulting brethren, like some of the skills that they were really good at and I had no exposure to as a banker.
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. So like, financial modeling questions came my way, and like market map, competitive analysis questions went their way. And
Yeah.
so that was interesting. But yeah, training was relatively brief compared to investment banking training. Um,
Yeah. And so then you started, and what was the day to day like? What was like a typical week or typical day? Was it just looking at opportunities? Were you sourcing? What was the funnel like in terms of?
yeah, so at the associate role there, typically they would staff up a quote unquote deal team with like, depending on how large the deal and what stage it was,
Mhm.
with a senior partner, like a principal VP type, and then an associate. So fairly lean. I mean, almost never more than really three people on a team.
Right.
And then there was also an analyst level, but and at BCV the analysts were really solely focused on sourcing.
Hmm.
So
Are those
more
right out
like
right out undergrad? Those
yeah,
folks?
most of them were right out of undergrad, and most of them also kind of transitioned out after a couple of years, as opposed to having career track to associate and then MBA and continuing on. Although some of the really exceptional guys did do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I didn't come in with a strong network to go out and like source,
Right.
and so it was more like getting staffed up on a live opportunity with a partner, or kind of principal level person who had been shown a deal and wanted to dig in on it and start, either modeling it out on the later stage, or like just diving into the technology and sort of market positioning for the earlier stage stuff. But um,
So like, were you involved in like actually putting together like investment committee memos like you would in private
yes,
equity, and
yes,
doing all of
yes,
that and putting the deck to getting the model together, industry analyses, all that?
yeah, 100%. And yeah, like I said a little bit earlier, we were, even on the earlier stage stuff, Series A, and sometimes earlier, we were putting together pretty robust analyses.
Got it.
So not your typical like couple pages
Still the
as you see at
monster
some
pitch.
venture shops. So
Did you have to make it beautiful, or were they more forgiving than your banking peers in terms of the perfect alignment of the fonts
I
and
want to say, like, yeah, it would be rare that I would get like a stylistic nit at midnight, but we still made relatively good
consultants?
looking.
But your consultant peers probably had really good skills in PowerPoint, so
Oh
you're
yeah,
probably yeah
yeah, yeah.
tough. You have,
So I think, yeah, the standard was pretty high for that, and also because the investment committee, whether it was a late stage kind of growth deal like uh, Bain Capital invested in LinkedIn in the Series D, or a Series A that I might have been working on. Uh, both of those process and those documents would make it through the investment committee, which was like literally 12 partners sitting around the room, and so like there was a pretty high bar to get through those committees, and definitely not a run and gun kind of venture model where you see some, like, especially now that I've been spending more time in venture, you see some places where partner likes a deal, partner does the deal.
right.
And Bain Capital was a little bit more like formulaic, and applied that same formula and process to some early stage deals, which I think they've probably massaged that process a little bit to accommodate
They've
and
been
stay
forced.
competitive at the early
They've
stage.
been forced to loosen it a little.
Well, especially with early stage deals,
Yeah.
and obviously I can't speak to it as much since I've left many years ago, but
Yeah.
just to stay competitive with sort of the Silicon Valley types that move much faster and can kind of like get through a process on an early stage deal within short time frames.
So you're there for a good couple of years.
Yep.
You, I assume, learned a lot. But then,
Yeah, I mean, it was a really good opportunity to learn that asset class. Just having exposure to the growth deals was very comfortable for me, because it was very much like banking in terms of like building a large, multi-$100 million and sometimes $1 billion investment valuation in case.
mhm,
Um, and then on the early stage stuff, it was just really piqued my interest, and I kind of discovered that I loved emerging technology at that time.
mhm.
And so, yeah, just like a lot of other folks in my class, it was really usually a 2 and out program, and almost everybody went to business school, or in some cases joined startups. But
But
yeah,
you
out of
didn't do
my
that.
four
You did,
class, three of us went on to business school. Myself and one of my best friends there went on to HBS, and then one to Wharton, and one stuck around for a little while at BCB.
but you didn't do that, or you did. You actually, yeah,
I,
you went. you went
Yeah, I
to,
went straight from there to
oh, you went
HBS
to
for 2 years.
HBS right after that. Because that makes sense. So
Yeah,
you did 2 years
yeah,
banking, 2 years venture, and then HBS. And then you went to PE.
yeah.
Or
So
then
yeah,
you
no,
did
that's
an
right.
internship in PE.
Internship in PE.
And then tell
Exactly.
me,
That was really, I think, like to satisfy my like the voice in the back of my head, which, I, as we talked about earlier in banking, it was like, well, you're going to go from banking, then you'll go to private equity, and it's sort of like a done deal. Well, when that didn't happen, I always kind of thought, well, if I have the skill set and I find the right group that I would enjoy working with, private equity is a pretty darn good career. So maybe I should, scratch that itch and test it out. And so I did, super fortunate to find a group, Norwest Equity Partners, based in Minneapolis, not to be confused with Norwest Venture Partners, which is similarly has a similar LP base, but is focused on venture and is on the West Coast. But the middle market private equity firm Norwest Equity Partners is where I spent my summer at Harvard Business School, and I had an absolutely amazing time there. So, like, I guess part of the challenge for me was that I as I thought about like whether or not I would like private equity, I loved the team there, and I had um, some like friends of friends and even some family friends that knew people there, and so like it was an instantaneous fit. A lot of the same interests and like I said earlier, kind of a cultural fit there. But
Mhm.
as I was dating my now wife, as I came back from that internship, I was like, gosh, everything was so good. I had an offer in hand. So I'm coming back to business school with an offer in hand,
Right.
and obviously like very, very excited and proud to have received that offer. But you know, a lot of late nights and deliberation, and fortunately good advice from my now wife, but about, what is this, what you really want to do with your life, and what keeps you up at night in a good way, and what like wakes you up in the morning in a good way. And for me, that wasn't middle market private equity, unfortunately, even though the team and the offer were fantastic. And
Yeah.
I think I'll say this: if I did private equity, it would have been there. But I think I was just kind of too bit by the growth bug, and so
You
went
had
back to the drawing board and
you
started
were
interviewing.
Yeah, you were willing to kind of coast in your second year. Although, to be fair, you had uh, you know, coming from HBS, you're probably going to get other interviews. So
Interviews, yes, but like I think the scariest thing was, um, first of all, like the venture capital community, I think is probably as small or smaller than the private equity community in terms of jobs. And
right.
then also there's just fewer junior roles. I think because you have a lot of venture capital firms like the one that I'm a part of now, where we have like two senior people and really like no real junior people.
Right.
Um, and so as a result, there's not a lot of like associate and senior associate seats just sitting out there like there are in private equity. So that uncertainty was certainly scary for me to go back. And I ended up having to interview, I think, for like from the time I turned down the offer from Norwest, I think I interviewed for like, off and on, but as much as I possibly could for like 10 months before accepting an offer.
And was that because you just weren't finding the right fit, or were you trying to get back into a venture fund
Yeah, I
aggressively?
mean, I was talking to a bunch of venture funds,
Yeah.
and then some of the ones were like that I was really interested in were West Coast only, and I kind of wanted to stay in the Northeast.
Yeah.
So there was that angle. Then there was just the frequency was there were a fair number of people looking to get into VC, and not a lot of interviews. So I was certainly interviewing fairly regularly, but if I had stuck with PE, I think there would have been probably more opportunity. And so just had to be patient and wait for somebody to come along that was
So,
interesting and compelling and also venture.
so how close were you to graduating before did you come close to graduation without an offer in hand?
Yeah. So trying to think, gosh, it was like, yeah, right around the time of graduation that I ended up locking it up. And then I ended up starting that fall
Got it.
um, at Samsung. So Samsung was going through kind of an interesting, they were building a new group from scratch that was focused on tech and software.
Mhm.
And they had an M&A arm and a VC arm. And I was fortunate to be, I guess, the first hire underneath the managing director on the venture team. So, um, yeah, that was a fantastic opportunity to get back into the venture game and to see it from obviously like a different angle, working at a corporate. But yeah, working in a huge company like Samsung with a lot of brand recognition, it made building the group a little bit, building it from scratch was a little bit easier.
an internal venture fund within a large corporate like that, how is it structured in the sense of like, are you guys given a mandate of a certain amount of like funding, like assets under, like it's not a typical AUM model or you raise a outside fund with LPs, right? So are they like, hey, here's $500 million, go, go have fun, or how does it work? Or you just kind of source deals and
Yeah, so there's so many different flavors of it, as I'm sure you know, but
yeah.
We had the benefit. So the group I was part of is now called Samsung Next,
Okay.
and we had a predecessor that is still operating called Samsung Ventures, and so they had actually established like a fund of their own, and we were able to kind of piggyback on that in order to get up and running quickly.
Okay.
And there was talk about like having our own dedicated fund with dedicated capital from the company, and I still don't think that's happened to this date, but there were a lot of like tactical things just with regard to getting the whole group stood up and like operational that, I think just having assets to deploy was the number one goal. And while I was there, we had plenty of capital to deploy, and
Mm-hmm.
we're still kind of feeling out our mandate, which, depending on who the CEO or who the, oversight of the corporate was, would change over time. So you saw this sort of like sinusoidal change between being super strategic versus being super financially oriented.
Interesting. And so what do you think in the 3 years that you were there, how did it change? Like, how did that wave kind of change for
Yeah, I
you? And
mean, well, so I guess what I'm describing is kind of it would change almost like quarter or biannually. So that made it sometimes difficult where like you'd find, and that's probably why I'm not there any longer, was that I came from Bain Capital where it was like our number one goal is to make fantastic investments and achieve great investment returns.
Mhm.
So my orientation as a business person and as a VC, even as young as I was towards that. And then, I had to like learn some new tools and techniques at Samsung in order to like play the game and get stuff done, get deals done that were both financially oriented and also made a strategic impact on Samsung. And that required me to be me and the whole team to be more political and like learn the ropes of a company that was thousands and thousands of miles away,
Mm.
and that we were fundamentally trying to find software and technology to invest in, knowing full well that we had something like 75,000 of the brightest engineering minds over in Korea that were going to like help us to either review or shoot us down or think that they could build something better. And so there
Yeah.
was that kind of ongoing tension between not invented here syndrome and other things that sometimes worked against us.
So were you not able to, you were able to get deals done, but was it not at the rate that kind of satisfied you, or like, was that a frustration?
Yeah, it was definitely, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think it was partially
That
that,
would be really frustrating.
well, at that stage in your venture career, like I think the more ownership you can have over a deal, number one, and the more deals that you can put on your track record to sort of like build that over time, those are two really important things. And so I was starting to get really good ownership over some of the deals,
Hmm.
which was good, as in like being able to like lead and bring deals to the table on my own,
Yeah.
as I got a little bit more senior there. But yeah, the frequency of getting deals done was not as high as I would have probably liked. And then you would get a no-go decision for like a variety of different reasons, which was difficult to navigate and sort of difficult to swallow over time,
Hmm.
where we might do a very strategic deal one day that didn't feel like a great financial decision from my perspective,
Hmm.
and then the next day we would do a financial deal that wasn't very strategic. And so I think the consistency of like how we made decisions has gotten a lot better over time, but while I was there we were still filling it out.
So it sounds like that played a lot into the reason of going out on your own. Tell me a little bit about kind of that whole process, because it's kind of daunting, I'm sure, to
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
branch out.
um, I think it all sort of grew out of what I just was mentioning, which is like get your own track record, build your own book, like live or die by the sword, so to speak. Like you have to do your deals, you have to validate that you have good decision making and also good guidance of your companies once you've invested. And so I think the only way for me to do that in the most like clear and scorecard driven way was to really do it on my own, and also notably probably not within the context of another large firm like Bain Capital, where you would have still had at least one layer of sort of oversight, as in like a managing director, that, would have taken many, many years to get to that level. So, I met my current partner, who was an entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur, and an angel investor. And he was actually an angel investor into a deal that I was deeply diligencing. And through that process, we both started kind of co-mentoring the CEO of that company. He was an investor in it, and I was just an interested party who wanted to help the entrepreneur. And so over the course of, probably 18 months, I had, monthly or quarterly check-ins with this young founder. And through that process, my now partner sort of saw, hey, not all VCs are bad. Like, he was coming at it from the entrepreneurial side, and he got to see that I really like to be operationally involved with the portfolio companies, whether I invested or not. And so we got to know each other through that entrepreneur and our sort of shared interest in the space that he was operating in. And fortunately, my business partner sold his business, and so he was looking for sort of a new full-time way to deploy his time. And he had a great angel track record that I was able to sort of take a look at and validate that, hey, this is a great operator and great entrepreneur, but also B, somebody who understands how to invest. And so I thought, boy, that's a pretty rare breed and a nice compliment to somebody like me who really came from like the financial and investment world and less operational. So we came together to start Studio in about 3.5, almost 4 years ago now. And we're in the process of raising our second fund right now.
Congrats, man.
Thank you.
Super exciting. And so you've made how many investments have you guys made in Fund 1?
So 14, Fund 1 was very small, and we got it off the ground as fast as we could, and made 14 investments out of that fund, and have now started making investments out of our second fund, just committed to our fourth deal out of that fund.
Great.
So we're continuing to raise, as I mentioned, but it, candidly, I think that was part of the impetus for going off on my own, which is like, if you want to make a career out of this business, you need to be able to obviously have the track record, get the experience, and be sort of like the first call on the call sheet for an entrepreneur when they say like, hey, I either have a great opportunity in front of me or I have a huge challenge in front of me. Am I going to call an associate or am I going to call like managing director? Well, the answer is really easy. You call the managing director. And so if you want to be that call, right, which now fortunately I'm in that position to be that call, that's sort of what I was aiming for. But the last part of it was, you got to be able to like raise capital and build relationships. And so I think if you want to make a career in this industry,
obviously your role from Bain Venture to now has shifted dramatically. You're not putting investment committee members together. You're doing a lot more of the outreach, I assume, and the networking, the building, and those relationships in the specific spaces you want to be in. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly managing a large and growing funnel. I mean, always growing the funnel, but also trying to be efficient in sort of validating and passing things down through that funnel and prioritizing continuously with just two partners. I mean, it's
hard.
We see hundreds and hundreds of deals a year, and so just trying to get through that is a pretty big effort. But it's also the most exciting part about the job is that like every day I wake up to an inbox full of great ideas and some not so great ideas, but the great ones are what really gets you excited, and like you just want to like talk all day about it, and like I said earlier, it keeps you up at night in a good way.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me a little bit about the actual jump from Samsung to doing your own thing. Was the initial capital used in Fund 1? Did you raise an outside? Did you have LPs, or was it mostly through the funding of your partner and your own capital?
So I was fortunate in that my business partner and current partner had sold his business very successfully,
right?
And so he was able to put up a significant amount of the first fund. And so that was enough to sort of get the boat off the dock. And then when I joined, we ended up raising from a total of about 27 LPs, of which many if not most came from him because he had been raising the fund on kind of his own for a little while. And then when I hopped over, I was able to bring in a few others and round it out. So now as we go to Fund 2, it's like a lot of the relationships have become shared, and we've continued to build those LP relationships, which fortunately with our different backgrounds, Liam and my networks are fairly complementary. So
that's great.
Trying to leverage that and continue to scale the fund.
What do you think's been the hardest part about kind of going out on your own? Just getting all the operational stuff set up, or what's the? Do you need a lot of virtual assistants help, or
Yeah,
what's
no,
the hardest?
it is. There's nothing that doesn't fall on your plate, I think.
Mhm.
Whether it's like health insurance, paychecks, whatever. And it can be a huge time sink. So I think like leveraging outside and inside resources, with a limited kind of asset base is key. And I think prioritizing and maintaining your core focus, which is finding amazing entrepreneurs, making sure the top of the funnel is full and the bottom of the funnel is full of the best distillate. I think you just have to really try to take the 80-20, meaning
Are
the
you
80
guys?
is finding great deals and the 20 is keeping the train on time.
Are you thinking of potentially once you have fund to raise, potentially bringing on some junior help, some interns, anything like that, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, so we've had a few interns over the years, mostly like summer interns from HBS and other places, and so that's been a huge help. And I think, looking back, as I said, there's not a lot of venture seats out there, so it's I think it's a benefit that goes both ways in the sense that, um, you know, this is a mentorship driven business, and so like to have an intern who's exceptionally smart but doesn't have a lot of VC experience, I think can be a win-win for us. And so we'll certainly look to do that again in the future. And then, depending on how large the fund is when we kind of wrap it up for fund two, we may have the opportunity to add to the team at the associate or analyst level, but certainly not a necessity. I mean, I think we've become pretty accustomed to managing the deal flow with just two
Yeah.
partners, but would certainly be nice to have another set of hands sometimes.
For sure, for sure. So before we wrap it up, anything just looking back at your career that you kind of want to give your younger self some advice in terms of things you would have changed or things you'd tell the younger listeners in terms of advice as they kind of map their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke a good deal on how difficult the decision to turn down the Norwest private equity offer was.
Hmm.
And I think like that enabled me to do a lot of soul searching and like um, and self assessment, which was forced because like it was a necessity. It was part of making that decision. But I think um, looking back, I kind of wish I had done that more and earlier in my career rather than just saying like, where's the best next place to land? And for me that was like investment banking, private equity, and then like business school. And it turned out that my path was some of that, but some not that. And so I think being open minded and doing a self assessment, as I said, to learn that like, hey, what I really care about is working directly with people who are changing the tech landscape, changing the world, coming up with new ideas. That's what I'm really passionate about. And like whether or not I can build it, an LBO model in an hour, that's fantastic that you can learn that. But on the other hand, if that's not what you want to do all day, it's good to learn that earlier rather than later. And so I was fortunate to learn it when I did, but I think being self-aware earlier on in your career can be really helpful.
Great words to live by. I think we'll end it there. Well, Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to come on.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Great to connect, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Awesome. And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. And until next time.